So my talk is entitled Newtonian Shamanics. It's a play on the words Newtonian mechanics. For those of you who were paying attention in physics class, Newtonian mechanics is the set of physical laws devised by Isaac Newton, and they have spearheaded the scientific revolution since the end of the 17th century, when Isaac Newton was gallivanting around. Can anyone tell me who this fellow is? Christoph Koch. Thanks, Nick. So at a conference last year, he stated that he's famous for the quote, "No brain, never mind." So he's a firm believer that the brain generates consciousness. And at a conference last year, he stated that we are 20 to 30 years away from cracking the mystery of consciousness through science. Can anyone tell me who this guy is? This is Edward Witten. He's a very famous mathematician. In a recent panel of the top mathematicians and physicists worldwide, he got voted the #1 living mathematician. Even Stephen Hawking says he's #1. And he's famous for amalgamating the 5 existing string theories into one unified theory called N theory. Now, in a recent conference, he said that we are going to find the theory of everything, that is, reconciling gravity with the other 3 fundamental forces, but consciousness will forever remain a mystery to mankind. How close are we to the mystery of consciousness and solving it? So here's their contrasting views. So, Newtonian mechanics is a mechanistic, materialist view of how reality works. And it seems to be the dominant school of thought in Western science and Western medicine. Here are some of the laws devised by Isaac Newton, the 3 laws of motion, Newtonian gravity, and force equals mass times acceleration. Here's a clip art picture of Isaac Newton with an apple falling on his head, where he had the epiphany and realized the nature of gravity. However, that was all to change when Einstein came along. So the special relativity, which is the first theory of relativity that Einstein devised in 1905, he stated that when approaching light speed, the physical laws of Isaac Newton are redundant. And relativity has been proven to be accurate to 12 significant figures. Now here we have an observer at the very center. This plane here is present moment. Here's the future light cone, here's the past light cone, and the diagonal lines are light speed. So nothing this side of the diagonal lines of the cones can be observed because they would have to be faster than light speed. So we only observe what is within light speed. So the left is special relativity in a nutshell, and the right is general relativity, which he came up with in 1915, and that is his law of gravity, where he stated that gravity is in fact space-time curvature. So if we compare the two, so we have Isaac Newton's interpretation of gravity. He said that gravity is a force that acts instantaneously between 2 objects with mass. And space and time are absolute or fixed entities Therefore, 1 meter is always a meter, even no matter how fast you're traveling. Even if you're traveling light speed, 1 meter is always a meter. And 1 second is always a second. Regardless how fast you're traveling, even if you're at the edge of a black hole, a second is always a second. Now, Einstein, he turned Newton's theories on their head. He said that space and time are relative entities, and gravity is the curvature of space-time. Mass tells space-time how to curve. And then along came Schrödinger and quantum theory, and opened up a whole new can of worms. So at the subatomic scale, when we're observing fundamental particles, that is anything smaller than an atom, things behave extremely bizarre. So here we have the double slit experiment. If you fire photons of light at the 2 slits and there is no observer, no device to measure them, then they form a diffraction pattern. Even if 1 particle is fired 1 at a time, it will still form a diffraction pattern. Almost as though the particle reaches this, splits in 2, and then interferes with its split partner on the other side. Now, when you have a conscious observer or some sort of device to measure which slit the particle goes through, it collapses into a definite particle with definite orientation in space and thus makes 2 marks, as you would expect from the particle. Here we have quantum entanglement, which for me is the most important aspect of quantum theory. Now, these quantum particles have 3 different properties: spin, angular momentum, and spatial orientation. And when you get 2 particles which are quantumly entangled, for example, if you fire 1 photon at a prism, glass prism, which then splits it into 2, each new particle has half the energy of the original particle. So each particle has a wavelength twice of its original parent particle. And these are now quantumly entangled. If you measure the property of one, you automatically know what the property of the other one is going to be, because there's a law which balances, which states that the other one will be the exact opposite of the one that you measure. So if you measure, say, the spin of one particle, before measurement it can exist in all possible permutations, and only via conscious observation or using some sort of device to observe its spin, for example, if it has, say, an upspin on observation, you know that its quantumly entangled particle would have a downspin, because that's the fundamental law of the universe to maintain balance. Now, the funny thing about quantum entanglement is that it can occur between 2 quantumly entangled particles on opposite ends of the universe instantaneously. So, in a sense, it overrides Einstein's relativity, which is built upon the foundation that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. But it's been observed that these can interact instantaneously, and sort of, in a way, they are interacting in possibly a dimension beyond space and time. So perhaps there's a greater reality that exists in levels above the physical domains which are restricted by space and time. Many scientists and mathematicians say that they claim that God must be a mathematician. Paul Dirac said that God is a mathematician of the highest order. Nikola Tesla stated that to some people there is God, to others there is the law of physics. So to him, the law of physics is a manifestation of God, in a way. Here we have a painting by William Blake. Now, I don't agree with the notion that God is a mathematician, because mathematics only uses the left hemisphere of the brain, which is responsible for logic, mathematics, science. The ancient Egyptians, they had a system of mathematics and language based on hieroglyphs. It used the right-hand side of the brain, the right hemisphere, which is responsible for creativity, art. And through a series of symbols, it could have multiple meanings. Like it could be like, say, a shopping list, but also mean the love that a mother has for a child. And they had multiple meanings, and it was using the right hemisphere. So I believe that if the ancient Egyptians continued and weren't conquered, perhaps their language and mathematics would be the dominant base for our current science. So we only perceive a very tiny range of all that exists. Here is the electromagnetic spectrum. This, between these two black lines, is all that we can visually perceive. Everything between 400 and 700 nanometers. Yet, the full spectrum goes well beyond that, and we can detect these with technology. And that goes to say for all our other perceptions as well. We are living in a material world, and I am a material girl. A famous verse from Madonna's song, Like a Virgin. And we have Karl Marx, who wrote the Communist Manifesto and was really against material capitalism. It's a slide I added this morning. I just wanted to give an example of how, touching on politics with Karl Marx, I observed aphids behind my house and how ants farm them, they protect them. If an aphid gets sick, the ant would move it away from the rest of the colony so it doesn't infect them. And the ants protect them from predators. In humanity, when people get sick, we put them in hospital with loads of other sick people where they often, it exacerbates the illness and they pick up superbugs. So scientific consensus materialism. We're led to believe that everything that exists in the universe can be made up of all these particles which form the standard model of particle physics. And recently the Higgs boson, which is responsible for gravitational forces in matter, that was recently discovered a few years ago, and that is now a complete model. And this is the four fundamental forces of nature: electromagnetism, weak interaction, strong interaction, and gravitation. And we're led to believe that everything in the whole universe can be made up of these particles and these forces. Everything. And this way of thinking has been applied to matters of the mind, emotions. So in a sense, everything can be made through an equation or algorithm using only what you see here, including, say, the emotion of love. Now, scientific consensus materialism, or SCM, as it can be abbreviated to, also stands for Santa Claus myth. Now, the Santa Claus myth is not entirely mythological. Those who are familiar with St. Nicholas would know that it is slightly derived from St. Nicholas and also Siberian shamanism. So Santa Claus was not invented by Coca-Cola Corporation. Now, Siberian shamans used the fly agaric or Amanita muscaria mushroom in healing ceremonies. And the word shaman actually originates in the Siberian steppes. So I'm going to touch on Abrahamic religions very briefly.
Is shaman a word for medicine then, in a way?
Yeah. I'll come on to that later. So, Eckhart Tolle says that Abrahamic religions are mind-dominated religions committed to dogma and a rigid belief system. It seems to me that with Abrahamic religions, that is Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, which the majority of people on this planet are part of, it seems to be so obsessed with the afterlife that people forget to live in the present, in this life. And there's so many laws that you need to adhere by in order to make it into heaven. It also states in the Old Testament that humans are granted free reign to rule the planet and dominate all other species. I think that phrase has been blown all out of proportion if you see the way that we're using the Earth's resources at an alarming rate. Here we have Abraham about to sacrifice his favourite son, and stopped by an angel messenger, just in the nick of time. So I want to briefly mention some Eastern spirituality and philosophies which have been integral to my own reality tunnel over the past few years. Ramana Maharshi, he had a mystical experience at a very young age, and then at the age of 16 he ran away from home to live on a mountain where he remained for the rest of his life. So powerful was his mystical experience that he felt that the physical reality which he was presented with was just an illusion. And so he went off to this mountain to live and find a truer reality that he was more comfortable with. Now, he said that the body is Maya and the physical world is Maya, an illusion. He also said that the mind is Maya. We often get so caught up in the abstractions of the mind. So he would say it's all an illusion. Sogyal Rinpoche, he wrote the Tibetan book of living and dying. He said there are two beings living within each and every one of us. One is the ego, and one is the true inner self that rarely surfaces because we're so caught up in the egoic mindset. This is Maharaji. He was the guru of Ram Dass. And he had zero ego. He needed an entourage to take care of him because otherwise he just wouldn't eat. He'd wander off into the jungle and probably get eaten by a tiger. And he had a rare gift he could read people's minds. And if you know the story of Ram Dass, the Harvard psychology professor, who after taking LSD realized that the whole academic system that he was a part of was just a farce. And he went out to the east to find more truth, and he came across Maharaji, and Maharaji pointed him out in the crowd and told him to come to the front, and he said, "You were looking at the stars last night and thinking about your mother." And Ram Dass was in fact looking at the stars, and his mother just passed away. And then he tried LSD. Ram Dass had a few pills of very strong LSD on him, and Maharaja said, "You have some medicine with you, show me." And he took out 3 pills of LSD, each 400 micrograms, so a total of 1,200, which is a colossal amount. And Maharaja grabbed them, swallowed them. They waited and waited and waited, nothing happened. And then Ram Dass went back to America, and it's like, hold on, something's not right here. 1,200 mics, like, it's a hell of a lot. So he went back, and Maharaja said, "You come to the front. You have the medicine with you. Show me." He took out 4 pills, totaling 1,600 micrograms. Grabs them, swallows them. Nothing happens. I think it's safe to say that his ego was non-existent, and he lived in full presence every moment.
So this is why it was not affecting in a way?
Yes.
said he had no ego, but he had an entourage
to look after him. Yeah,
to look after him, like to take care of him.
to take care of him. Yeah.
To have an entourage, it's like this, I'm the big king ego thing about me.
No, he just wandered around. He didn't care who followed
Like
him.
a child.
Yeah, like a child, exactly, free from conditioning. And it is the conditioning that causes, I guess, bad trips. Yeah. So if you're completely free from ego and present, I think it's very, very, very unlikely to have a bad experience with psychedelics and entheogens. This is Shiva, the destroyer and creator of universes. Now, in Hinduism, they say, many people say there's millions of gods. I personally am more drawn to the notion that there is only one consciousness, and we are all derivatives of the singular consciousness. Now, there is a philosopher called Bernardo Castro, who worked at CERN, the particle accelerators, as a software engineer. And he goes one step further, bringing that notion maybe more towards science. And he says that there is one consciousness, and we're all derived from that in the same way as someone with split personality disorder, dissociative identity disorder. So we're all dissociated identities from the singular consciousness. And there's various spiritual practices that you can utilize to regain the oneness with the singular consciousness. This is Buddha. He devised the meditation method called Vipassana, which is a form of, you do body scanning until you get in such a state of presence that past trauma and memories resurface that you thought you'd never remember again, you thought were lost forever. And if you scan your body, they seem to bubble up and resurface and come to your frontal cortex where you can reprocess them. And the main idea behind Vipassana is to have thoughts that do not leave a trace. And it seems particularly in the West, we're so plagued by memories of the past that many of us often live in the past. So this is a way to resolve those past memories which can cause trauma. I always had somewhat of I used to fantasize about becoming sadhu. I've been to India many times, and last year I had an ayahuasca experience where I had a beautiful vision. I became a sadhu in India, in the Himalayan foothills, and I was meditating under a banyan tree for days and days and days, and that turned into months and years. And then I became petrified wood, and my dreadlocks combined with the roots and the branches of the tree. And then my spirit transcended, and I became like a botanical spirit, guardian of the whole forest. And then when the ayahuasca wore off, I was a human again.
What is a sadhu?
A sadhu is a truth seeker. So they shun material reality, and they don't have any material possessions, and they leave their family, friends, and all their material possessions behind in order to go on a quest to seek truth, because they're not happy with the truth that is presented before them. This is the Kumbh Mela festival, where the sadhus come out of hiding. It occurs once every 3 years, and there's a gathering of often many, many millions on the banks of the Ganges River. This is a Naga sadhu. They follow Shiva and they drink from a skull. So, on to shamanism. Shamanism, in fact, was at the core of many ancient civilizations in order to guide the civilization as a whole. Now, ancient Chinese were governed by shamanic emperors. And they often shun Western science and material reality in favor of the transcendental realms and the spirits they communicate with in these realms. So can Newtonian mechanics, which has been the dominant school of thought in Western science and medicine, be reconciled with shamanism? Shamans do not rely on empirical, objective evidence as science does. Yet, it seems to be very useful in treating matters of the mind. Gabor Mate, the psychiatrist, he refers to the society we live in as a toxic culture. Now, as an ex-microbiologist, if a petri dish is full of bacteria and 50% of the bacteria have a chronic illness, you throw it away. It's unusable. Now, in America, 50% of adults have a chronic illness and 70% are on daily medication. What does that say about the culture we live in? It seems to me like we've become domesticated as a species. And if you look at certain domesticated animals, they would not survive in the wild. We've become domesticated through capitalism, materialism, and chemical enslavement.
There's a brainwash.
Yeah,
Very
indeed.
intelligent brainwash.
So here we have a Western doctor from The Simpsons, very realistic, and a shaman, Maria Sabina, who was a Mexican shaman, and she popularized shamanism in the West because Gordon Wasson, who wrote extensively about psychedelic mushrooms and shamanism, he went to visit her. There is a clear divide between mind and body in Western science and medicine. They tend to treat the body like almost like a car. If there's something wrong with a part of the body, like a car, it's an isolated component. And with a car, that isolated component can be replaced. And we know that it doesn't affect anything else in the car. It doesn't have like a knock-on effect. Like if the wheel's busted, you replace the wheel. But that mindset is also a dominant mindset in Western medicine. Now, shamanism is a more holistic approach to healing. There is not the divide between the body and mind. In fact, the mind is considered above the body. So Western medicine has proven to be only marginally more effective than the placebo effect. The placebo effect has about 30 to 35% success rate. With medicines used for mental health, such as SSRIs, they're only about 50% success rate. I know personally I would choose placebo any day over the SSRIs.
So you're generally saying mind over matter.
Got it, yeah. Does anyone know this guy?
Yes.
Yeah, the Iceman, or Wim Hof. Now, a few decades back, his wife suffered from bipolar disorder, quite bad, and she committed suicide, and he was so devastated because he was so torn. And he had, I think, 5 children, and he was so depressed that instead of turning to Western medicine, he turned to cold. And I'm not talking like running in the park on a cold winter's day. I'm talking about immersing himself in ice and ice water. And he got to a point where he could do superhuman feats. He's got the world record for sitting in an ice bath that is 0 degrees for 2 hours. A normal human being, at 20 minutes, their body temperature would go below 32 degrees. And below 32 degrees, you can no longer raise your core temperature. You will die. You need to be externally heated. even if your body temperature went below 32 degrees and you were taken into this room, you will die. You need to physically be heated. Now, he went beyond that to 2 hours, and he claims he does it all with his mind. They've performed many experiments on him. Recently in Poland, they injected him and some of his disciples, people that he taught his technique to, they injected them with a bacterial endotoxin. Now, if you or I were injected with this bacterial endotoxin, we would go into a state of toxic shock. We'd get fever symptoms, we'd be shivering, we'd feel like shit, basically. And what he did, he used his breathing technique to pump his blood full of adrenaline. And the endotoxin had no effect on him or his trainees. When they measured the adrenaline level in his blood, it was far higher than that of someone doing a bungee jump for the first time. Now, with his technique, he was able to tap into his autonomous nervous system. And this is unheard of in Western science. If I put a gun to your head now, you'd be pumped full of adrenaline. But you couldn't just be like, and be pumped full of adrenaline. It wouldn't work. But he claims to be able to do that.
To be in a meditative state and still be full.
Control your autonomous nervous system. It's called autonomous nervous system because we cannot control it. It's automatic. But clearly he can. And he trains people all over the world how to do it. And recently he climbed Everest only wearing shorts. He did a marathon in the Arctic Circle in mid-winter only wearing shorts. And he did a marathon in the hottest desert in the world wearing shorts and taking no water.
The hottest.
Sorry?
You also checked the hot.
Yeah. And I met him in April this year. And I mentioned my relative who has PTSD. And he says he takes people with PTSD, anxiety, depression to climb Kilimanjaro wearing only shorts to show them that the mind is everything. Now, here we have a famous case in the UK. These were two twins living in Bristol. And they only communicated with each other and they developed their own language that no one could understand. And after several years, when they reached about the age of 29, they realized they can't have a normal life because they didn't communicate with everyone. So they decided there and then one of them has to die. Within a day, one of them died, purely with the power of the mind to help the other sister.
What was their problem? They were communicating with?
Yeah, they weren't living in the real world. They just made their own language and they only spoke to each other. They didn't speak to anyone else. Here we have dissociative identity disorder. Now, there's been countless documentations where people with this disorder, in one personality, they have a disease or ailment, like diabetes, high blood pressure. In another personality, totally fine. Mind over matter again. Touching on the ego, and which is now dubbed the default mode network. So the egoic or default mode network state of mind is what we usually occupy in our everyday waking life. It's where we reside in when we are daydreaming, when we're thinking about the past or worrying about the future. That is when it's most active. And here you can see the regions of the brain that light up when you're in the egoic mindset. Now, psychedelics and entheogens, they disrupt this default mode network and promote healing states. Now, here's an image taken from the research done by Imperial College London. This was done by Professor David Nutt and Robin Carhart Harris. Now, here is placebo. You can see the regions that are lit up. This is the default mode network regions that are lit up. And here is after treatment with psilocybin mushrooms. And you can see that there's very little activity in those regions of the brain. In fact, I went to a conference last year when there was a lady from the States whose name evades me, but she was doing LSD research, and she showed how the brain lights up on LSD almost exactly like a child below the age of 3. So perhaps the ego only really develops from the age of 3 onwards. So these are psilocybin mushrooms. I'd like to add there, a few months ago I was with my friend who's got a 4-month-old baby. And I was holding the baby and she was staring me in the eyes, not blinking, just fully present and focused. And then she shat herself and did not lose eye contact. Why is it we could never do that? Because we're so conditioned, you need to go to a toilet. Most of us couldn't even shit by a tree these days. The conditioning runs deep. So I want to touch on the war on drugs, which Richard Nixon, he started in 1971. Now, incidentally, when he started the war on drugs, Bobby Kennedy was opposed to it because his wife had actually undergone successful LSD therapy. And this guy is the Philippines president. He recently said, Hitler killed 6 million Jews. We have 6 million drug users in the Philippines. I don't see why we can't kill them all. Now, in the UK at least, 90%, having worked at a drug and alcohol addiction clinic for 2 years, I can say that 90% of people with addiction problems in the UK suffered childhood trauma. Now, this guy wants to kill those people. It's tragic. And incidentally, he uses fentanyl, which is a very powerful opiate painkiller. And he says he's only meant to take half, but sometimes he takes a whole one to get a buzz. So this is a guy that is running a country. So how can psychedelic therapy and shamanism help where modern Western medicine fails? So for the more common forms of mental health problems, ADHD, anxiety, depression, and PTSD, Western medicine seems to be marginally effective. As I said before, slightly more effective than the placebo effect. But they also rely on you taking the medication for a prolonged period, perhaps the rest of your life.
Addicted, be a good customer.
Yeah. So it fits into their whole profit-mongering system. And often with these medications, they have side effects, and you need to take another medication to subdue the side effects. Vicious circle. So I want to point out these 2 books. The one on the left, The Body Keeps the Score. It's a psychiatrist that wrote it, and he dealt with Vietnam veterans. And he devised a technique called EMDR, where you follow his finger back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And eventually, your brain's defenses go down, and lots of repressed memories and trauma resurface and can be reprocessed by your frontal cortex. Very powerful technique. On the right, this book was written by a friend of mine, Dr. Frederica Michael Fisher. Now, she was a psychiatrist for many, many years, and then she decided to give it up because it wasn't really helping people. And she went to learn holotropic breathwork under Stanislav Grof. And after completing the course, someone on the course gave her 2 MDMA pills and said that psychedelics are still legal in Switzerland, perhaps you should explore psychedelic therapy. She had never touched an illegal drug in her life, but her and her husband took the MDMA pills, and she had a vision. The vision was of her father dead on the bathroom floor, covered in blood. And until that moment, she had no recollection of her father at all, no memories. She went to ask her mother, and mother told her that she, as a little girl, was the first person to encounter the body of her father who was murdered. So that trauma was buried so deep within. And the way MDMA works, it represses the amygdala, which is responsible for fear. And when that's repressed, you can deal with every kind of trauma without having the powerful emotional response to it. And you can process it and overcome it. These are two friends of mine. Alex Seymour wrote Psychedelic Marine. He was on the front lines in Afghanistan at the age of 42, and upon returning, he had such severe PTSD. He decided, he was influenced by Graham Hancock in making the decision to go to South America and drink ayahuasca. And after a series of just a few ayahuasca ceremonies, he was cured, and he's been cured ever since. And he wrote this book in about 3 weeks. This is a friend of mine called Steve MacDonald. He was a soldier for the Australian Army, and after returning from combat, he had PTSD, untreatable PTSD for 15 years. He got hold of the MAPS handbook for MDMA therapy and treated himself, and after just a few sessions was completely cured, and he now lectures all over the world, and this is his website if you want to check it out. Now, on to comparing the brain like to a computer. There are those that say the brain is simply a computer. It has 86 billion neurons, 7,000 synapses on average per neuron, 50 neurotransmitter substances. Now, each synapse has about 1,000 molecular switches. If you do the maths, 86 billion times 7,000 synapses times 1,000 molecular switches, we get about 6 quadrillion connections. That is more than all the computer networks on the planet combined. And there were some say that the internet is now conscious. I'm not one of those people. Is consciousness algorithmic? Can it be reduced to a computational algorithm? I'd like to point out a phenomenon that occurs in people with Alzheimer's. Now, 5 to 8% of people with Alzheimer's undergo what is known as terminal lucidity. So as they come close to death, they are in a vegetative state, and on examining their brain, they often have large vacuoles, and their brain's decayed by as much as 50%. And they're literally in a vegetative state. They can't communicate, they don't remember anything, they can't take care of themselves. Now, in the last week or last day before they pass away, 5 to 8% of these people achieve full cognitive faculties. And they often call up their loved ones and friends and say, you know, I love you, thanks for being there, and goodbye, this is it. And that is an anomaly that cannot be explained with conventional science.
Say again, my father has Alzheimer's. He was saying in the
last few days, it often occurs in 5 to 8% of Alzheimer's sufferers.
Suddenly they're awaken and come back to life.
Full cognitive faculties.
Leave their vegetable state.
Mm-hmm. Only briefly, enough to pass on important messages to loved ones and friends.
Did they really try psychedelics on Alzheimer's? Someone has done a series. Is it helping?
It was done in the 50s.
Alzheimer's and psychedelics.
And also on autistic kids. I'm not sure about recently, but in the 50s, yes.
Proven effective.
We can have this discussion after. Okay, there's also been many documented cases of people that lack huge chunks of their brain. There was a girl that was a physics student with an IQ of 120. Her whole brain was almost missing, and she just had a thin film of grey matter touching the skull. There was another Asian woman that was missing her cerebral cortex, which contains 79% of all the neurons in the brain. Yet she was perfectly fine. She was a little bit uncoordinated, so she couldn't dance, but in terms of school, she was totally fine. So, what does this point towards? Some might suggest it is clear evidence that consciousness is non-local, and the brain somehow receives it like an antenna. You're going to like this one. Okay, Sir Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff devised the OR theory, quantum theory for consciousness. Roger Penrose said that any theory in physics that neglects consciousness will be fundamentally short of providing a genuine description of the world. Now, Stuart Hameroff provided a framework, a material framework, for which consciousness interplays with the brain. And they're focused around the microtubules in the brain and the individual tubulin polymers which form the microtubules. Now, he says that these tubulin monomers can exist in two possible states, quantum bits, so they store information in two possible states and every state in between. So they can exist in a superposition of states.
Sorry, Jack. It's about 7 minutes past 1 now, so if you need to leave, or would like to leave,
I was told no time limit, but I'm almost done.
Oh, okay. Do you know how long more you need?
Maybe 10 minutes?
10 minutes. Maybe if people need to leave, you can leave.
Okay. It's just 10 minutes to go, guys. So, Robert Anton Wilson, he wrote Cosmic Trigger. He said everything that gets into the brain affects your reality tunnel, your worldview, or your belief system. He had a very interesting talk that he did about belief systems, which he abbreviates to BS. And he says, don't believe in anyone else's BS. Don't even believe in your own BS. Ramana Maharshi, going back to him, he says, the mind is Maya. So do not believe in any of the conjurings of your own mind, even. I'd like to touch on my own personal near-death experience. It happened while I was in India, and I just recovered from a severe bout of dysentery. And I was bedridden for days, and I was extremely dehydrated. And I decided to get away from that city, and I jumped on a train. And then on this train, I had a series of blackouts, and then the final blackout turned into a whiteout, where I was completely blind, and there was this really intense white light that didn't seem to have any particular source. It was sort of coming from within and without me, and my body was completely numb. I couldn't feel anything. I described this sensation as when I accidentally exploded a tiny stick of dynamite in my hand, and my hand went completely numb. You could have stabbed it and I wouldn't have felt it. That's how my whole body felt. And I was so focused on using all my energy to just breathe, because breathing was almost impossible, and all my conscious awareness and energy was focused on breathing. And it went on for hours, and I was totally sure that I wasn't going to make it back, and if I did make it back, then I'd have severe brain damage and be like in a vegetative state. And then after some time, I started to let go and relinquish resistance. And when that happened, I sort of completely left this physical reality and just glided on this wave of light. And it felt like the whole time there was someone else in my experience that was witnessing anything. And I had like a communion with this other intelligence. And my whole life flashed before my eyes. Everything that, all the bad stuff that I put my parents through, and some of the bad stuff that I did to people, and I really made a promise that I'll turn my life around. And it felt like the whatever entity I was communicating with was telling me I need to come back. I need to come back. There's more that I need to do in this life. I was ready to go there. It was so beautiful. I was happy to go. And when I did come back into my body, my eyesight slowly started to come back, and I was seeing everything as like very few colors and pixelated, almost like an old school Nintendo game, Super Mario on the NES. It was like really blocky and pixely and very few colors, and then more and more colors came and more pixels. And then my full eyesight was restored. And I felt incredibly healed and rejuvenated, and as though I'd be given another chance. I also had another experience where I was involved in a road accident where I was hit by a motorbike when I was on my bicycle. And it hit me, and the whole event took perhaps a second, but it was drawn out. So much so that I could remember every detail vividly. And I've spoken to many scientists about this, and a lot have said, oh, it's adrenaline. I was in competitive sports most of my life, and adrenaline does not have that effect. Just a few days before that, my mother bought me a helmet for my birthday, and I just started wearing it. And I landed on my head in the fall. And without the helmet, I'm pretty sure I would have died, because I got quite bad vertebrae damage to my neck. And after that happened, my descriptions to the police were so accurate that it went to court, and the other guy didn't stand a chance because I gave such vivid descriptions of everything. And I couldn't sleep for days after because of the pain, and it was perhaps a combination of the sleep deprivation and the incident itself, but I kept mulling over. I should be dead. If my mum hadn't bought me a helmet, I'd be dead. And the fact that time seemed to dilate, I was like, something weird's going on here, like maybe I've got a guardian angel. And I got in this loop, really deep into this loop, and I was laying in bed all night unable to sleep, and it kept looping that through my head. And I was like, maybe I'm like sort of like some sort of prophet or something. And then a few days later, I watched The Life of Brian, and this scene came up, which brought me back down.
Now you listen here. He's not the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy. Now go away.
She says, when a rabble of religious fanatics are chasing her son home because he fulfills all these prophecies, and they're waiting outside the home, and the mum looks out the window and says, he's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy. And so that kind of brought me down to earth. But yeah. Is reality a simulation? There was a recent poll in Forbes where they interviewed many tech CEOs on whether the reality we live in is a simulation, and over 50% said we're living in a simulation. Even Elon Musk said it's more than likely we're living in a simulation.
You mean we are inside the matrix for real?
Yes.
Not like consciousness, mind.
Matrix. This isn't a new notion. The Gnostics, which predate Jesus, they believed that the demiurge is not allowed back into heaven. The devil, some people refer to the demiurge as the devil, he's not allowed back into heaven, and he's jealous of humanity because we have the ability to transcend and be at one with God. And through his jealousy, he created, created the physical universe to entrap human consciousness, and we merely extend it through our own conscious ramblings, our own ego manifestations. We extend the physical universe. And there's been several notable people throughout history that have managed to break free of the illusion and transcend, one being Buddha, one being Jesus. But in Gnosticism, everyone is equal, and we all have the ability to break free of this mortal coil and transcend. So that's an interesting one. The holographic universe theory. I mentioned Edward Witten at the start, the world's #1 mathematician. He's now collaborating with Juan Maldacena, a very talented Argentinian mathematician. And the holographic universe theory incorporates all the previous theories I've discussed, but takes it one step further. So they've now managed to amalgamate string theory, M theory, and reconcile gravity with the other three fundamental forces. That is the theory of everything. They've managed to do that through a quantum explanation, describe gravity through quantum explanation. So how does it work? So the holographic universe theory is in a nutshell, is that all the information in the physical universe is stored at the quantum level in a two-dimensional format on the surface or boundary of the physical universe, which can also mean the surface of a black hole, because that is the edge of our universe as well. We have no idea what goes on in a black hole. It could be a whole another universe. So all the information stored in the physical universe is stored in a two-dimensional format at the quantum level, the smallest possible scale, on the surface or boundary of our known universe. Coming to the end now. So here is a scale that I've devised. On the left we have Newtonian mechanics, mechanistic view of reality. On the right-hand side we have Shamanism, where they shun mechanistic reality in favor of the transcendental realms and the spirits they encounter there, where they obtain their knowledge and wisdom and ability to heal. We have Einstein's relativity about a quarter of the way along, quantum theory about halfway along, holographic universe a bit further, simulation theory further still, Gnosticism further still, and I think I've put the Abrahamic religions about here, and Eastern philosophies about here.
This is a timeline.
No, it's a scale of mechanistic scientific interpretation of reality to shamanism, which is the opposite end of the scale, and every kind of belief system falls on that scale. So to conclude, since the Renaissance times and the time of Isaac Newton, it seems that in mainstream science they have tried to preserve a materialistic view of reality, but through trying to preserve this, they've produced no new physics. So here we can see that Newtonian mechanics was superseded by relativity, which was superseded by quantum theory, the most accurate framework we have in science at the moment, accurate to 16 significant figures. In my mind, consciousness is way beyond the frameworks we currently have. The standard model of particle physics and the four fundamental forces are inadequate. I believe we need a new science, perhaps one that incorporates more the ancient Egyptians' way, which used the right hemisphere, the creative, artistic hemisphere of the brain. It seems our whole interpretation of reality in Western science is built on the thought processes devised by the left, logical, scientific, mathematical part of the brain. Perhaps there should be a balance between the two hemispheres in order to create a new science which can then tackle problems that we haven't been able to resolve with the Western scientific mindset. So, basically, the crux of my talk is to carve your own reality tunnel. And rather than just using your mind to try and understand reality, it's often better to use your heart and follow what really resonates with you. And try to resist indoctrination and dogma. And I actually don't believe in anything. I've explored many theories, many religions and spiritual belief systems. I don't believe in anything except love. And I believe that through love we can unite as a species, and we can connect our minds with our bodies, and then our species with nature, and we can turn the planet around, and we can save the planet. And I believe we need to live more from love and compassion rather than the egoic mindset, which is destroying the planet. And I think it's safe to say that, for example, Donald Trump is like the collective adolescent male ego of humanity manifested in a human being. Evil. but we all have that within us. Some further reading. If you want to take a photo, maybe. And if you want further info, here's my website. I do nature photography, landscapes, and ultra macro of insects because there's so much beauty in nature. Selfie, yeah.
Isn't it
How
about
flattering.
like a fractal? You show the landscape, and then
Yeah.
you show the microorganism, and then you see it's the same structure, the same DNA, the same formula.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Fractal.
yeah, yeah.
If you're able to see the same, zoom in, zoom out in the galaxy, and also in the bugs, micro.
Yeah. Uh-huh. And here's the website, which is going to contain far more information on what I've discussed today. Thank you.
Thank you.